In 1958, Scout Motors set out to create the first compact pickup truck. But today, we know Scout Motors for their sport utility vehicle segment that back in the day used to compete directly with automakers like Jeep. But due to difficulties competing with more major automakers, specifically the Big Three, a strike plaguing Scout Motors in 1979, a recession in the 1970s, and overall limited brand recognition, Scout ended up shuttering its door and the last Scout vehicle rolled off the assembly plant in 1980. And while you may think that this was the end of Scout Motors, you'd be wrong, because in 2020, Volkswagen became the owner of the Scout trademark, and in 2022, so now 2 years ago, Volkswagen announced that they would be bringing back the Scout brand, which brings us to present day. Because on October 24th of this year, Volkswagen officially announced the revival of Scout Motors in electric vehicle form. They did this through the announcement of the Traveler SUV and the Terra truck, both off-roading focused, both electric, and both looking oddly familiar. Now, I gotta admit that I have a bit of a soft spot for Scout Motors, because my dog, who passed away from cancer a few years ago, was named Scout. And while I have to admit I named her after Scout from the book To Kill a Mockingbird, not from Scout Motors, I still feel a bit of a soft spot for anything that's sharing her name, which means that I'm a big fan of the new revival of Scout Motors. But in all seriousness, the personal connection to the name Scout aside, people, including myself, are excited about Scout Motors making a revival, not only because it's an EV, not only because of the iconic nameplate, but because both the truck and the SUV look good and are, at least as of now, being advertised at an attractive price point in the $50,000 to $60,000 range. But in today's video, I actually don't want to talk about the excitement of Scout Motors and their new vehicle lineup. In fact, I want to talk about the exact opposite, because while consumers are excited, dealerships are pretty pissed. And that is because, like many EVs, but most notably Tesla, Rivian, Lucid, Scout Motors will be selling their vehicles to consumers through the direct-to-consumer model, a trend that electric vehicle manufacturers have been following, but that doesn't mean the dealerships are okay with it, nor does it mean that there haven't been pushback by dealerships to try to change that. And in the case of Scout Motors and Volkswagen dealership groups are far from happy. In fact, less than 12 hours after Volkswagen revealed that Scout Motors would be selling direct-to-consumer, dealerships started threatening lawsuits. Now, for those of you who may be a bit unfamiliar with the relationship that dealerships and automakers have and how electric vehicles are kind of shaking this up, let me briefly explain. And this is a topic that I really love to talk about, because while many of you, of course, know that I am an automotive YouTuber that makes videos about cars in the car market, what some of you may not know is that I worked in franchise consulting for many, many years, in fact, my entire career, so this topic is one that I am actually uniquely qualified to discuss. And what you need to know here is that dealerships are franchised. At least the large ones like Ford, Toyota, Chevy, those are franchised. Which means that when you go to most large dealerships like your local Ford, Toyota, Chevy, Volkswagen, these are dealerships that are independently owned and operated. Similar to how your local Subway, McDonald's, or 7-Eleven gas station is also locally owned and operated through the franchise model. But unlike your local McDonald's, 7-Eleven, or Subway, where those brands typically choose to franchise because of the growth benefits that come along with franchising, like using other people's capital and not having to grow with a bunch of debt, the scalability aspect where you can have vested owner-operators and you don't have to search for a bunch of general managers throughout the entire country. There is a real scalability benefit that comes along with franchising, which is why so many large nationwide brands choose to franchise. But in the case of dealerships, it's actually a little bit different. Dealerships, in many regard, continue to franchise today because they have to. In most states, it's required for dealerships to sell to consumers through a franchise model, meaning Ford actually can't sell cars to you directly, they have to use a dealership as a middleman. And while this rule dates back to the 1930s and was originally put into place so that manufacturers could focus on research, development, production, and marketing, while dealerships could manage sales and service, this has remained the status quo today, despite the fact that the buying process feels antiquated. And the vast majority of consumers not only dislike it, but they actually hate it. And this is because, well, the same reason why many antiquated things in this country continue to be at play, and that's lobbying, special interest groups, and big money. NADA and the franchise industry have spent a ton of money keeping dealerships in operation and preventing manufacturers of vehicles to be able to sell cars directly. And that's because of the fact that dealerships make a ton of money. So of course NADA, which is the National Automobile Dealer Association, they of course want to keep dealerships at play because they benefit from it. But the franchise industry does as well, because dealerships are a huge part of the franchising industry. So these two groups, as well as a slew of other groups associated with dealerships and franchising have been working together to prevent automakers from being able to go direct to consumer because, of course, if automakers were able to do so on a mass scale, this would be bad news for dealerships and franchising in general. But this was really shaken up whenever Tesla entered the picture. And as a result of Tesla's direct-to-consumer model, electric vehicles have kind of given automakers a bit of a loophole where they can actually sell direct-to-consumer like never before. And while we are seeing EVs being sold direct-to-consumer with EV-only brands like Rivian, Lucid, and Tesla, we are also beginning to see direct-to-consumer sales through legacy brands that now sell EVs. For example, Polestar, which is an arm of Volvo. And now Volkswagen is looking to do this exact same thing with Scout Motors. And while Volkswagen said on record that they decided to go this direction because they felt as though it was best for not only the consumer but also the dealership, with Volkswagen citing that of dealerships nationwide, 49% of dealers are not excited about selling EVs at all. And on the flip side, with studies showing that only 8% of consumers have high or very high trust in dealers. And so if dealership groups are not excited about selling EVs, and if consumers don't trust nor do they want to work with dealership, it makes sense to bring this new brand direct to consumer, I guess. And that's what you'd think. But despite the fact that 49% of dealerships are not excited about selling electric vehicles, Volkswagen dealers are very, very angry. With the CEO of NADA, or the National Automobile Dealer Association, stating to attempt to sell Scout vehicles direct to consumer and compete with its US dealers partners is disappointing and misguided. At the same time, the director of Automotive Trade Association stated, assuming they take this other path, let's face it, there are going to be challenges and problems for them virtually everywhere across the country. My counterparts around the country are not just going to roll over. But on the flip side, the CEO of Scout stated, we want a brand that you can have data trust and customer trust, because I think it's finally into place that people are apprehensive, and rightfully so. We can control the customer data, secure the customer, and not badger our customers. So that's what we're looking to do here, and that's what we will do. And you know, this probably comes as a bit of a shock, but the CEO is right. It truly feels as though dealerships want to have their cake and eat it too. And as a consumer, I am totally over it. Dealerships want to keep prices muddy and not be transparent with their pricing. They want to continue dragging out the car buying process in order to get as much money as possible as they can. They want to prevent the customer from getting the information that they need in order to better understand the purchase that they're going to make. And while dealerships will hear these statements and they'll say, oh no, that's not true. None of this is true. We don't want to hinder the car buyer. But it is absolutely true, and it is reflected in the fact that dealerships across the entire country have been pushing back on the CARS bill, which would basically protect consumers from all of these complaints and more. And this is something that dealership group and lobbyist groups are pushing against because they don't want transparency, they don't want easy purchases, and they don't want customers to know exactly what they're getting into, because the truth is, if they did, dealerships would make less money. And while dealerships don't want to change their own ways and they want to continue squeezing out their customers, whenever automakers decide to pivot and change their own strategy to better accommodate the customer, dealerships cry about it. Now, the sort of comical approach that Volkswagen is taking here is they are basically arguing that Volkswagen dealerships are not Scout dealerships, and as we sit here today, there are no Scout dealerships throughout the country. And just because Volkswagen owns Scout doesn't make Volkswagen privy to selling Scout Motors. And while I do believe that this is a valid argument, it is no doubt going to be one that's going to be met with intense pushback. Because as I mentioned earlier, lawsuits are and will continue to brew if Scout Motors doesn't decide to go the dealership route. Now, I would love more than anything to see the traditional dealership model get flopped on its head. I think dealerships are toxic, antiquated, and I think by dealerships and the franchise industry pushing back on automakers going direct to consumer, I think it really goes against everything with American values in business, which is basically this idea that American business is pro-competition until that competition becomes a bit too dangerous. But as much as I would like to see Scout Motors go 100% direct to consumer, if I was a betting person, I would be willing to bet that Scout Motors and Volkswagen do something similar to what Volvo and Polestar did, which is considered to be a bit of a hybrid model. Polestar was acquired by Volvo in 2015 as an EV-only arm with no dealer network, but Polestar has a hybrid approach of both the direct-to-consumer and dealer network model. And I predict that in order to avoid lengthy and costly court cases, Scout Motors and Volkswagen will end up taking a similar approach. In order to stay on the relatively good graces of NADA and the franchising industry, I just think Volkswagen will ultimately end up having to compromise, even if technically this isn't what's best for the consumer or the brand as a whole, but only time will tell. Remember that my courses, the Car Sharing Masterclass, is on sale for Black Friday until November 30th. You can use the code BLACKFRIDAY275 for $275 off the Car Sharing Masterclass, and my course, the Car Buying Masterclass, is on sale until November 30th as well. You can use the code Black Friday $125 for $125 off that purchase. Like always, you guys, if you have any questions, comments, if you have anything to add, I would love to hear it, so make sure to leave a comment down below. And while you guys are at it, make sure to hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next video.